Module 9 is flow trigger and action properties. This is something that you would tend to do during the building of your flow, as well as primarily at the end to make sure that when it goes live that there's no overhead or sort of too much requirement on the Office 365 to run these processes. So the first thing we look at is while we're building the flow, we will naturally put in different parallel branches based on if an action does something successfully, carry on down path A, but if the action has failed or there was a timeout issue, then we can have different parallel branches to respond in that particular nature. And I've also shown in module 7 how we can create a run after based on a scope of actions, a group of actions. So when the group is all great, or if any one of those has failed, then we can branch down to a particular path. The run after settings is successful. So the preceding trigger or action control ran successfully, and in a scope that means all run successfully. Has failed, the preceding trigger, action or control did not run successfully and produced an error, and that could be any one of the items in a scope could have failed, resulting in the whole thing as a failure. Is skipped is when for any reason the actual action was not run. Has timed out is when the action has got an amount of time that's been set for it and a number of repeats, so it will repeat a number of times, waiting in between each time. And if that whole timed out setting has failed, then you'll have a has timed out response. Let's have a look at that has timed out in detail. So SharePoint shows a maximum number of items of 5,000 per view. In Power Automate, when I'm using the get items, it actually only brings back 100 at a time. This is deliberate to make sure that I'm not pulling down the internet a huge amount of items, excessively more than I need. But maybe 100 is not enough, maybe 5,000 is too much. So what I'm going to do to make sure I get the right number of items, I'm going to create a view in SharePoint. I'm going to base it on the original one, but I'm going to adjust it so it sorts the data by the requested date from the most recent date to the oldest. And now when I come into the get items, I'm going to when I come into the get items, I'm going to show the advanced and make sure that I am using that items from recent first view that I've just created. Now that's only sorting the data. I could have limited the items in the list in SharePoint, but I can do it through the Power Automate using the settings of the get items action and using the pagination. So the pagination is by default bringing back the limited amount. So in Excel that's 250, or it brings back chunks of 256 records, and in here in SharePoint list it seems to be 100. And bear in mind there's 700x amount of items inside my list now through that huge amount of copy and pasting I've done. And I'm now going to test it. Now this is the first time I've run the Power Automate with 700 or in excess of 700 items. So the apply to each is going to be a challenge. So here you can see after 10 minutes of processing that data, the flow timed out. So I want to change a couple of things. One, I want to reduce the number of items it's bringing back. And secondly, I would like to increase the timeout just in case there's some delays or some issues. So I'm going to take this back to edit mode. Let's go and have a look at the settings and using the pagination. So the pagination is by default bringing back in Excel that's 250, or it brings back chunks of 256 records, and in here in SharePoint list it seems to be 100. If I go into pagination and turn that on, So I want the threshold of items to be 150. And bear in mind there's 700x amount of items inside my list now through that huge amount of copy and pasting I've done. So I'm going to click done. I'm going to save this flow and I'm now going to test it. Bear in mind that I've now gone from 8 items that it's right looping through to either 100 or 150, hopefully not all 700 because I'll be here for a long time. So if we expand that on, and you can see I did set it to 150 out of the 700 items and it's gone to 200. So the importance is that the pagination, whatever you set your limit to, it's going to keep going until it goes beyond that number. So because it's doing it in increments of 100, I've done 150, so it's done 100, and it's tried to get the other 50 by doing the other 200. It's going to do it in groups. So I'm going to be bringing back 200 items in there, and there's not much I can do about that. It's just the way the Power Automate has worked. Now the timeout did occur, and as I said, I want to increase that timeout so that it's a bit more patient with it, or maybe I should decrease the number of items and bring back. Realistically, I'm not going to be using, hopefully I'm not going to have to go through 150 orders per week. That's a bit excessive, but the idea was to set the boundaries so you can see what was going on with regards to that. So let's go back and edit the item. So the get items is set to a pagination of 150. The timeout sort of exceeded the limit, and the limit seemed to be after 10 minutes it just gave up. So I could sort of set the timeout limit to a little bit longer. So let's put in there, I would like to sort of increase this to 15 minutes. Now, always worth having a look. Check the ISO 8601 format for duration. Get it from the ISO.org website, ISO 8601 date and time format HTML, and that will then show you how the actual formats are worked. Bear in mind, we already know about ISO formats because we saw the year, month, day, how it works with that. So 15 minutes, I am being dumb. 15 minutes times by 60 is 900 seconds. So I'm going to put in a timeout for 900 seconds, and it's PT. So PT 900 seconds. What's the retry policy? So I can now say I would like a default retry policy. I've got the exponential interval, which I can then allow the specified number of times to retry. I can say I want you to retry 4 times. I want an interval between the actual retry about 2 minutes. The minimum that I want you to wait is going to be 1.5 minutes, 90 seconds, and the maximum interval, let's not go crazy, let's do 1 hour. So I can basically say after the timeout we can retry a certain number of times. I've briefly mentioned the concurrency control, but the way it works is if I'm using an apply to each or something that's pulling in multiple objects, the concurrency allows me to choose how many of those items are run concurrently at the same time. So I can say turn on concurrency control, and I would like you to pull in the items, and let's do 10 items at a time. Now this will increase the amount of items that it goes through, decreases the amount of time that it takes to go through the 150 or 200 records I've got, but it is putting a lot more pressure, a lot more sort of performance on Office 365 to do that. So when you're doing the concurrency, go very, very carefully, because what you increase that to degrades on the performance of your tenancy to all the users. So if it's a really hefty load, you want that on a scheduled job to go overnight or at a time where it's quiet anyway. But with concurrency, you can speed up the flow, make it a bit easier to work with. That reduces the timeouts that you're likely to get. But again, the other weighing side of that is the performance that you get deteriorates over the number of parallelisms that you put inside that. I only said that word once because if I say it more than once, I'm going to slur. So that word there we go. So I've put that to 10 now, and you can also monitor that through the outputs. So the time that it takes, and you saw that timeout earlier, and I increased it to 15 minutes, etc. What I could do is increase the concurrency to 10, run 10 parallel items at once, and I could then look at and test the flow and look at the timings it takes to do it at that measurement. It's very important to note that when you're working with an apply to each, or anything that uses or works with multiple items or actions at the same time, when you're placing a variable within the apply to each in order to manipulate it, you will get an option saying enable concurrency control for the apply to each leap and set its degree of parallelism to 1. And this is because a variable can't have multiple values, which is what it would need if you increase the number of or degree of parallelism to more than 1. So it wouldn't work. I'm going to say experiment, because when I've done this, and you really shouldn't increase the level of concurrency when you're working with DIMMs inside the apply for each. When I've actually tested it on many occasions, it's been fine, and that's only because I've been incrementing values, and it increases for each time that I work with it. But when you're setting a specific value and there's 10 is running 10 of those at the same time, which one of them is the value the variable should store? It can't have all 10. It must only have one variable, one existence. It's one dimension, remember. So be very careful with that. I've done the concurrency on my example. That's because I was only incrementing. So out of 10 times, that would have increased to 10 anyway, no matter what order those items would have processed. But when you're setting the value can only have one. The variable can only have one value. You also have a concurrency control on triggers. So it's the number of times, maximum number of times, that the flow will run at the same time. So if I've got 20 people that are entering stationary requests and they've all clicked that flow at the same time, what I can do to take the stress off of Power Automate is set the concurrency to about 10. So if 20 people are adding, basically it's like having 10 McDonald's tills open, and I've got 20 people, there's going to be 2 people per till roughly. So what this just works in a better way to limit the number of pressure I put on the flow. You can have the degree of parallelism, got away with it again, from 1 up to a maximum of 50. You'd never want any more than that anyway. In fact, in many respects, when you're working with items in data, working with flows, you'd want to be quite considerate with the amount of work that you're pushing on. Bear in mind, the other side of that scale is that if someone has created an item and they're in that queue, and you've got the concurrency limit quite down low, then the longer it's going to take for their flow to run, they'll see the result appear in the list, and any further actions that they are waiting for to actually trigger off. So for this demonstration, I've created a new flow, and what I've done is just a manual trigger. I've initialized 2 variables, one called count A, one called count B, and then I'm going through my stationary list, which has now got over 700 items in it, and I'm telling it to get all the items, so no limit. And in fact, what I'll do is I don't want it to time out, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to set the pagination and say roughly 500. Let's just get 500 of those items. But then what I'm doing is I'm experimenting with this, the asynchronous pattern. What I'm going to do is I'm going to turn it off, which is something you don't do unless there's a specific reason. So I'm going to click done. Now the idea is I want 2 parallel actions. Now I want to do a for each or apply to each, that's going to grab that value, and then I'm going to do a parallel action, parallel branch, doing exactly the same thing. So let's call that apply to each A and apply to each B. Inside each, it's going to go for each item, and all I'm going to do is increase the appropriate variable. So should I rename that variable at the top to initialize variable B? So this is going to now say, let's do a variable, and let's do a increment variable. Let's grab number A and increase it by 1. Same thing on the right hand side here. I'm going to increment the variable of count B by 1. So what impact will synchronous as it is have on this? Because at the moment I have got an API, I've got a connection that's going to get all the data, and then I've now got two actions here, and through this value structure here is now going to call and loop through that get items. And what I'm hoping is, as I do the synchronous, is that with synchronous it will go and do a job, but what it does, it blocks the callback, so it's not going to allow any other action to work on it whilst it's doing something. So when these call, one of these is going to run first, and when that happens, the other one will be sitting there waiting, but you won't see that happen. So if I save this, yeah, and I'll go and test this. Now this is the beauty of the power of videos, because you're not going to want to wait approximately 10 minutes for this to happen. So if I just do a save and test, continue, run the flow. Thank you very much. So I'm now going to have that flow run. The get items is going to take a while. It's got 500 items to sift through, but when that happens, I want to see what happens to the apply to each A and the apply to each B when it goes to those actions running. So I'm going to pause the video just to save you some pain. I'm going to come back when those get items has completed. Oh, that's completed quite quickly, 23 seconds. What about the apply to each A and B? So these look like they are running both at the same time, and it has pulled up that it's actually going through 500 records, and it's now going to sift through those, but I won't be able to see the variable until this is finished on both sides. So let's wait until that's finished. So apply to each B has finished, and that took approximately 3 minutes. I'm still waiting for apply to each A to finish, so we'll pause the video again and see how long it takes for that to complete. So the job's now finished, and it looks like it's actually taken about 3.5 minutes per job, but it's done one while the other was queued. It was waiting, it wasn't allowing it in, it had been blocked. So the get items has been set up synchronously, so that when I was calling it from one, I was waiting for that one to finish before it would allow me to go in and then use the other loop to go and get the work done. Now, why apply to each B got first and A didn't? It's like telephone calls. You know, if two people phone a person and they're engaged, they'll both get an engaged tone. First one to call back gets them when they're available. It calls through. So it was just waiting for they were just waiting for the option to be free. Now, asynchronously would allow, if I just go in and change this, give the edit button a click, would allow me to asynchronously call that API, call that actual that connector and its action, and be able to actually work with it both at the same time. So if I go through the settings and put on the asynchronous pattern, it will now accept both calls to it at the same time. So if I now save this and test it, now it took 3 minutes for the first one. It's because it's still running and calling both at the same time. I'm working with it. It's going to take a little bit longer. It's about 4 minutes, but 4 minutes instead of the total of what, 7 or 8 for those records. Let's have a look, see how that works. So I'm going to save this. And again, through the magic of video, I'll save you the pain of watching that timer go through. So the get items is now completed. I'm now waiting for both the apply to each A and B to run through its cycle and count the variables. Okay, that actually was a little bit quicker than I thought, but the rule to it is that the asynchronous has actually allowed both of these to run at the same time. So as soon as I was calling that get items from either one, the asynchronous was doing it in the background. It wasn't waiting or saying, no, you have to wait until I'm finished with this one before this one starts. So as a result, it's actually being able to process the information. And you can see it's quite quick. It's instead of waiting, I think it was 3 minutes for the first one, and then waiting another 3.5 minutes, so 7 minutes in total. Asynchronous has allowed me to actually work with the get items and process the data at the same time. So it was actually working, as it says, asynchronously. So how do I set that up? Well, the beauty of it is that when you do your actions, they're set to be asynchronous by default. So there's really, unless you know what you're doing and you know why you're doing it, the reason why it's so brief in the book is because we shouldn't be actually mucking around with that unless you know precisely why you are doing a synchronous pattern. The last one I'll touch on is the automatic decompression, which is enabled, and the idea is that when we send a request through Flow to our browser, it sort of sends up a request and then comes back with the information, and it's always gzipped. And gzip is a sort of a format of a compressed file, and it pulls it in. But the idea is the browser can then decompress and then display the information and allow us to manipulate it. Now, for whatever reason you turn it off, I have no idea, but I've never needed to do it personally. So the only likely reason why you would not automatically decompress is if the browser seems to be abusing the RAM that it's using for uncompressing it and manipulating it, and maybe it's not getting rid of the memory that it's set aside for uncompressing the zip. So what you could do in some way is leave it compressed, and then you would invoke a call within your flow in some way, probably via code, to deal with the zip yourself. That way, if you're doing it inside your own mentioned action, you can deal with the memory allocation and clear it manually. But we are talking about, I mean, many of these features that we're talking about here are very much high level sort of .NET programmer sort of specific. So the golden rule to these is leave them alone, don't touch them unless you know exactly why you're doing it, and there is a significant improvement to the performance and to the flow for changing it in the first place. The key to Module 9 is a lot of that stuff we can't really appreciate it unless we really play around and practice with that, and that can take an awful lot of time to go in there and sort of see a significant sort of idea about where timeout and asynchronous would actually take an effect, because you've got to run that for a significant number of minutes in order to compare and see what the advantages and why we do things in that certain way. So we looked at the configure run after, we looked at the trigger settings, and we looked at the action settings. We've seen some of those particular settings that may be of certain interest to you, especially when you're working with the large flows, manipulating large amounts of data or information. And that is Module 9.